This video is going to cover a technique for synoptic coloring in the traditional synoptic studies colors using Logos Bible software. Now, the tool that we'll be using to start with is Synopsis of the Four Gospels. You can find it in your library simply by searching for it under the word synopsis. And it's this one, the Synopsis of the Four Gospels by Kurt Aland. That's the best tool because it arranges the pericopes the way the print tool does. And when I open it up, I can see that I've got three or four of the Gospels arranged with their pericopes side by side for easy comparison. The difficulty with using this tool for synoptic coloring is that, unlike many of the other text modules available in Logos, the Synopsis of the Four Gospels tool does not permit highlighting. So we will show you the workaround for this particular problem. One of the most important steps in dealing with the synoptic highlighting technique is, of course, creating the highlighting palette. That can be found on the Tools menu and choosing Highlighting. Now, I already have a Synoptic Highlights palette defined. The easiest way to create a new highlighting palette is to start with an existing one and duplicate it. There's a little tool that will appear when I hover over the title of the highlighter pens here. I'll click it and choose Duplicate, and my duplicate highlighter pens palette appears here. Now, I'm going to rename this by clicking on the little triangle there again and choosing Rename. I might call it something like Synoptic, and then it will reappear in alphabetical order in the highlighting tool. The next step is actually setting up the highlighting itself. You can already see what I've done with my Synoptic Highlights palette, and that I've also set keyboard shortcuts. These keyboard shortcuts will be important in facilitating quickly coloring text. So for instance, if I wanted to highlight with text that appears in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, I'll highlight the text that I want and push T on the keyboard. The shortcut key can be set with this little tool here, again, this triangle at the right side of the particular highlighting style that I want, and I can choose a shortcut key here. You also need to keep in mind that these shortcut keys should be unique to the palette you're working with. Another important step here is, of course, setting up more than just the highlighter styles, but also the underlining styles. And if I choose Edit here on this particular style, you can see for my Matthew, Mark, Luke underline, it's a blue underlined style, and we can see it under Borders and Lines. All you need to do is simply select the bottom border and then choose the color you want from the color palette here. And then click Save when you're done. So once you've set up the highlighter styles, I've called mine Synoptic Highlights. There's another important step you need to take in order to keep your synoptic highlights all together so that they can be turned on and off for display purposes. We need to connect this Synoptic Highlights palette to a notebook using the Notes tool. To create a new Notes notebook, we pull down the Tools menu and choose Notes. The Notes tool appears, and to create a new notebook, we click the Notebook tool inside the Notes resource pane, and then push the plus button that's circled here to the right of notebooks. We get an untitled notebook and we title it whatever we'd like. I already have a Synoptic Highlights notebook, but once you've created the notebook you wish to create, whatever the name happens to be, you must connect your highlighting tool with the notebook tool by choosing again this menu with the triangle and selecting your notebook from this list that's headed with the word notebook. So I have this Synoptic Highlights connected to my Synoptic Highlights notebook. When I choose that, highlights I create will land in this one notebook called Synoptic Highlights. Unfortunately, I cannot simply highlight text in the Synoptic tool and apply it here. I have to apply my highlighting to individual panes in the Nestle-Aland text. And to do that, we simply need to create 3 tabs with the Nestle-Aland text. I clicked on Matthew 1:1 here to simply jump to my NA28 text, and I'm just going to choose duplicate 3 times here, even though you may want 4 panes. I'll show you why it's 3. I'm going to close this highlighting tool for the moment and then use a clever trick over here on the layout menu. There's an automatic vertical arrangement tool. I will click here and it automatically arranges the 3 tabs of my NA28 text. Now I'm going to go back and open up my synopsis tool again and perhaps move it over here to the left hand side. And if you'd like, create another tab to duplicate here that will represent the John text. Now I'm going to open my highlighter tool again, and now I've got the workspace more or less set up the way I want it. Of course, once you get the workspace set up exactly the way you want it, it would be a good idea to save the layout from the Layouts menu. You can click here, Save as Named Layout, and give it a name. You might call it Synoptic. You'll notice that as you work with the windows in this workspace, you can always come back here to the Layout menu and choose Update Active, which we'll do in a moment, to continue tweaking the workspace to exactly the way we want it. Before you save the layout, though, perhaps it might be a good idea to move to a particular pericope in the synopsis. And to move to a particular pericope in the synopsis, simply use the contents and the swiveling the disclosure triangles here in the various sections in the synopsis will reveal what we want. Let's choose this text, the cleansing of the leper. I just chose one at random here to show you how to do synoptic highlighting. Now this is a little technique that saves a little bit of time here. If I hide the table of contents here, notice how I have Matthew, Mark, and Luke in this triple tradition passage. And the time-saving technique is to open up Matthew 8, and Mark 1, and Luke 5 in the tabs moving from left to right. So I might choose, for instance, to click this central tab. And here's the trick. If I click Mark 1:40 to 45, it'll open in this particular tab. And then if I do the same thing here with this other tab to the right and click on Luke 5, and then I would do the same thing here, clicking on this, what represents my Matthew tab here, and then come back and click on Matthew 8. So now I have Matthew 8 Mark 1 and Luke 5 running from left to right. This is a good point at which to save the layout. So I'll choose Update Active. At this point, we're ready to begin applying synoptic highlighting colors to the text of each of our individual panes. I've chosen section number 17, titled The Imprisonment of John, which covers Matthew 14:3 and 4, Mark 6:17 and 18, as well as Luke 3:19 through 20. And in the synopsis tool itself, you will notice that Luke 3:19 to 20 emboldened in its pericope range designation. That is a clue to the reader on the part of the editor that the primary order in this particular pericope section, number 17, is thought to be Luke. We're going to work our way through this passage applying the highlighting colors I have here at the left to this passage. So this is a painstaking process involving comparison of individual words in the passage. So we're going to use the main colors of blue, yellow, and green highlighting or underlining, depending. Highlighting indicates usually particular agreement or almost total agreement between either all three or two out of the three of the Synoptic Gospels. Underlining means there's a parallel in some way, but it's not exact. Now, deciding whether there's exact agreement or not is sometimes a bit of a judgment call, but usually when there's exact agreement on the words, you highlight. If there's a different form, you might highlight the part of the form that's identical to one of the other Gospels. So this may lead to some coloring where you might have, say, blue and green on the same word, or different parts of the same word, perhaps we might say. So as we're reading this paragraph, starting in Mark 6:17 and 18, as well as on either side of this middle column, the passages in Luke and Matthew, we find that the passage begins with gar in both Matthew and Mark. So that's a Matthew-Mark agreement, so I will highlight the gar, or I should say I will select the gar. So I will select gar, and then I'm going to push M on my keyboard to apply that Matthew-Mark highlighting to that text. The gar here in Mark, likewise, pushing M. And ha Herodes is also in all three of the Gospels. So I'll use my T shortcut to apply blue highlighting to ha Herodes. Now I'm dragging across each of the words here before pushing T on my keyboard. That's my shortcut. So we mustn't neglect Luke over here. And so on. You notice how it's only in Luke that the tetrarch is a designation of Herod. In this situation, it's the words ton Ioannein that are parallel in all three of the Gospels. And of course this phrase en phulake, some people prefer to break the highlighting where there is a difference in word order. It depends on whether you think that's really very important for whatever observation you're doing in the text. You notice here that we have the verb edesen, he bound him. And that's found in Matthew and Mark, but not in Luke. And so here we're noting this agreement between Matthew and Mark. Now you will notice that dia as well occurs only in Matthew and Mark. Now here's the interesting thing. Of course, the name Herodias appears in all three texts, but there's a different form of Herodias, so you might decide here to underline rather than to highlight, to show that the name appears, but not in the exact form in all three of them. When I click to clear the highlighting, you can see the effect that has. Another possible way to designate this would be, of course, to say, this requires a little bit more dexterity and finer tuned work, but you might say, well, actually, the amount of agreement here extends to the first part of the word. Now, I'm applying both highlighting right here just so you can see. I'm leaving the da on Herodiada, so that I can highlight the fact that Matthew and Mark agree on the accusative, and that's obviously due to the dia preposition in front of them. You will also notice that the name Philip occurs in Mark and Matthew, but not in Luke. And again, the question becomes whether tein gunaika you regard as an agreement in all three, since tes gunaikos appears in Luke, but tein gunaika appears in Matthew and Mark. So an underline in blue is the safest way to designate this, but again, you could, of course, highlight this in yellow to show that there is, again, a difference between Matthew and Mark over against in the terms of the terms chosen, or the forms of the terms chosen in Luke. But we're back to complete agreement here with the words of his brother, and so I'm highlighting those as well. And the elegengar, of course, is also common to Matthew and Mark, but not to Luke. And here, auto in Matthew, I'm going to underline that because we find it's equivalent to Herode in Mark. And again, you could have decided perhaps to just highlight the toe of the article in Mark and just the toe of auto. And we find the almost exact agreement about it not being lawful. The difference, of course, being the substitution of the tein gunaika for autein, but still there's a parallel. That's why I'm underlining it in the appropriate color, which would be here yellow. Of course, our passage, according to the synopsis, covers verses 3 and 4 of Matthew 14. But we can also see an interesting parallel here between he considered him a prophet, and he feared John. So you might decide you want to reflect that in your observation. Our right-hand side column, of course, ends at verse 20 for this passage. So what you're seeing in verse 21 and following is the parallel highlighting for a different synoptic pericope. So if we took, for instance, the pericope on the baptism of Jesus, we see there's a great deal of similarity between all three of the Synoptic Gospels. There's even a more distant parallel in the Gospel of John, and this is why that fourth tab may come in handy for you, because you can also display that and flip back and forth between the Synoptic Gospels and John.